The wind came early that September. It came thin and sharp off the high peaks, carrying the smell of turned earth, and something colder underneath the promise of a killing frost, still weeks away, but already making its intentions known. It swept across the Callaway homestead in long, low gusts that rattled the loose shingles on the barn roof and bent the last stalks of a wheat crop that had already given up the fight 2 months before the wind arrived to finish what the sun had started. The land around Ridgecrest County had given nothing that year. The rains never came in June. The sky in July had been a merciless white dome pressing down on the valley floor, and by August, Emmett Callaway knew with the cold certainty of a man who had spent his entire life reading soil and sky that the arithmetic of survival had turned against him. He had known it the way a farmer always knows, not in his mind first, but in his hands. In the way the dirt crumbled too easily between his fingers. In the way the creek dropped an inch a week until the stones at its center were dry and pale as bone. He had borrowed against the first bad year. He had borrowed deeper against the second. By the third year, the debt he owed Silas Grundy had grown into something that could no longer be measured in dollars and cents. It had become a shape, a weight, a presence at the kitchen table that sat between him and his children every evening, without being invited and without ever leaving. Wren Callaway was 18 years old that September, and she had her grandmother's eyes, dark and still and patient, the kind of eyes that did not miss much and did not reveal what they had seen until the moment came when revealing it mattered. She had her grandmother Agnes's hands too long-fingered and capable, already calloused from years of work that had begun when she was old enough to carry a bucket. She was not a large girl. She was not the kind of girl whose presence filled a room when she walked in. But she was the kind of girl whose absence would have emptied it, though most people in Ridgecrest County had not yet understood that about her. Most people in Ridgecrest County had not looked at her closely enough to understand much of anything about her at all. Her brother Cale was 13, thin as a fence rail, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and a cough that had lived in his chest since he was 4 years old. Some winters it quieted to almost nothing. Other winters it came back with a violence that woke the whole house and left the boy gray-faced and hollow-eyed at the breakfast table, pushing his food around his plate, with the mechanical motions of someone performing a task his body no longer had the energy to complete. The high country air was bad for him. Everyone said so. The cold came down off the peaks in December and settled into the valley like a second floor, and the damp that came with it found the weakness in Cangle's lungs, the way water finds a crack in stone inevitably without mercy, without any personal malice, simply because that is what water does. He was a boy who read everything he could get his hands on and remembered all of it. He kept their grandmother's book, a small volume bound in cracked leather that Agnes Callaway had brought west from Ohio 40 years before, on the shelf beside his cot, and he read from it most evenings, his voice low and careful, moving through the sentences with the attention of someone who understood that the words had weight and needed to be handled accordingly. That was the family. 3 people in a house that had once held more on land, that had once produced more in a county, where the difference between a good year and a bad one was the difference between a life and the memory of one. Silas Grundy owned the largest cattle ranch in Ridgecrest County. He owned something else too, something that mattered more in a drought year, in any hard year, in the particular kind of year where a man lies awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and calculating the distance between what he owes and what he has. Silas Grundy owned debt. Specifically, he owned Emmett Callaway's debt, and he had owned it long enough and managed it carefully enough that it had grown into the kind of debt that does not get repaid, the kind that gets converted into land, into compliance, into whatever the man holding the note decides he wants instead of the money. Grundy was a man in his middle 50s, broad through the chest, with hands that had done real work in their time, but had spent the last 2 decades directing other people's labor instead. His face was weathered but not hardened. It was the face of a man who had learned long ago that patience was more effective than force, that a friendly tone costs nothing and disarms people more reliably than any threat, and that the best way to take something from someone was to construct the circumstances under which they handed it to you themselves, believing they had no other choice. He had a voice that rumbled like distant thunder even when he spoke softly. He used it the way a skilled craftsman uses a good tool deliberately with full awareness of its effect. He came to the Callaway house on a Tuesday evening in the second week of September. He arrived at dusk when the light was going amber and long across the dead fields, and he tied his horse at the post by the gate with the ease of a man who has visited a place many times and considers it, in some meaningful sense, already his. Wren was upstairs when he arrived. She heard the hoofbeats on the packed dirt of the lane, heard the front door open below, heard the low exchange of voices, her father's tightened, strained Grundy's smooth and unhurried. She did not go downstairs. Instead, she did what she had learned to do in the months since the debt had become a shape that sat at their table. She lay down on the rough floorboards of the narrow gable loft where she had slept every night of her 18 years, and she pressed her ear against the wood and she listened. Sound traveled through those thin pine floors the way water travels through cracked stone. It found every gap, every fissure, every place where two boards did not quite meet. She caught the conversation in fragments broken by the wind outside and the occasional groan of the house settling into the cooling evening air. Her father's voice first. "The note comes due in October. I can cover part of it, not all." Then Grundy, slower. The voice of a man who has never needed to raise it because the world leaned toward him when he spoke. "I am not pressing you, Emmett, but you have to think practical. The girl is 18, old enough to make her own way. And that piece of ground your mother left the Hollow Rock claim, it has been sitting there accumulating tax debt for 3 years. If nobody settles with the county takes it and sells it at auction. I would be willing to take that burden off your hands." As part of a settlement, a silence followed, the long kind, the kind with weight. Then her father's voice again, and what she heard in it was not anger, though the anger was there underneath everything banked low like coals. What she heard first was exhaustion, the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has finally arrived at the moment where he must either find somewhere to set it down or be crushed by it where he stands. She heard every word of what came after. She lay still and did not move and filed each word in the deep interior place where she kept the things that mattered most, the things she would need later in the dark when she was alone, and the only way forward was through the full weight of what had already happened. Grundy's boots on the porch eventually, the front door opening and closing, the sound of a horse turning on packed dirt, then nothing but the wind. The house went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of sound. Wren stared at the ceiling for a long time. She did not cry. She began instead to count a slow, methodical inventory of everything she owned in the world. One coat secondhand from the church charity collection 3 winters ago, still serviceable if you did not look too closely at the elbows. 2 dresses, one better than the other. A tinderbox. A small knife with a bone handle that had belonged to her grandmother. $17 in a tin on the shelf above her cot, every cent of which she had earned over 3 summers of work, mending, washing, whatever the women in town needed done, and were willing to pay for in coins rather than gratitude. And somewhere in the county, land records, a deed, a piece of paper she had never touched and barely thought about until tonight. The Hollow Rock claim. 40 acres of stone and scrub brush in the high country east of the Ridge Crest Peaks, left to Wren by her grandmother Agnes Calloway, who had died the previous spring with nothing to her name but that useless piece of earth and the stubbornness to have held onto it for the better part of her adult life. A soft sound on the stairs. Cale appeared at the edge of the loft, moving without a lantern, navigating the familiar dark with the confidence of someone who has memorized every inch of a space the way you memorize a piece of music, not by thinking about it, but by having moved through it enough times that the knowledge lives in the body rather than the mind. He climbed onto the mattress beside his sister without speaking and laid down with his shoulder touching hers. He had heard it too. They lay together in the dark for a long time without speaking. The lamp downstairs went out. The darkness became complete, the kind of absolute darkness that only exists in the country where there are no lights beyond the stars, and the stars that night were hidden behind a ceiling of moving cloud. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls of the house. The loose shingle on the barn roof knocked and knocked in its irregular rhythm, a sound Wren had heard 10,000 times in her life, familiar enough that she normally did not notice it at all. Tonight she noticed it. Tonight she noticed everything with the heightened, almost painful attention of someone who understands they are at the last moment of something. The last night they will lie in this particular darkness. The last night this particular silence will be theirs. "You will not go anywhere," Cale whispered. Wren found his hand in the dark and held it. She did not answer. The warmth of his fingers against hers was the most honest thing in the room, and the silence she gave him in return was the gentlest lie she had ever told. Morning came the way mornings come when the world is about to change. Ordinary. The rooster at his usual hour. The smell of coffee rising through the floorboards because Emmett Calloway was a man of routine, and routine was the last thing a man holds on to when everything else has been stripped away. Wren dressed in the half-light, the better dress. She came downstairs with her face arranged into something that might pass for calm if you did not look at her hands, which she kept pressed flat against her thighs. Emmett stood by the door. His back was straighter than usual, the way a man stands when he is bracing against something invisible and does not want anyone to see how hard he is working to hold himself upright. He did not look at her. His eyes moved to the far wall, to a knot in the pine boards, to anything that was not his daughter's face. He held out a small leather pouch. $17 every cent of what she had saved returned to her, supplemented by whatever small thing he had scraped together on top of it. In his other hand, folded and yellowed, the deed. The Hollow Rock claim, 40 acres of stone and high country, and whatever other secrets it held, passed from Agnes Calloway to Wren Calloway by the last legal act of a woman who had understood more about that land than anyone else in the county, and had chosen in the end to pass that understanding on through a piece of paper rather than words. A woman grown makes her own way, Emmett said. His voice was flat, emptied of everything except the words themselves. His hand, the one holding the pouch, trembled. Wren saw the tremor. She looked at it for one full second, and then she looked away and filed it in that deep interior place with all the other things that mattered. She would carry that detail with her into the long winter ahead. She would turn it over and over in her mind on the coldest nights, examining it from every angle, trying to understand what it meant. Not weakness, not cold, something else. Something she did not yet have the full information to name. She took the money. She took the deed. She crossed the threshold. The latch clicked shut behind her. A sound no louder than a pin dropping on a wooden floor. But it carried the weight of iron. She did not look back. She knew Cale was standing at the window, his palm pressed against the cold glass. She knew that if she turned around, she would not be able to leave. So she kept her eyes on the road and bit her lower lip until she tasted copper. And she walked. Then just as her boot touched the first step down from the porch, his voice, low, not calling after her. Not the voice of a man making a declaration. The voice of a man spending something he had been saving for a long time and was not sure he had the right to spend. Don't sell that land, Wren. His voice dropped even lower, as though the words were meant only for the air between them and not for the world beyond. No matter who asks, no matter what they offer, she stopped. She did not turn around. Behind her, she heard nothing more. No explanation, no additional words, just the particular silence of a man who has said the truest thing available to him and has nothing left to add. After a moment, she heard the soft sound of him stepping back from the doorway. She walked. The road into Ridgecrest was 3 miles of packed dirt and wagon ruts, and she walked it with the slow, deliberate pace of someone taking inventory. 1 coat, 2 dresses, a tinderbox, a bone-handled knife, $17, and a deed to a piece of ground that everyone who had ever heard of it considered worthless, and a father's last whispered instruction whose meaning she did not yet have the full information to understand. She rehearsed what she knew about the Hollow Rock claim as she walked. Agnes had acquired it in 1862 before the war was finished, when land in the Colorado high country could be had for almost nothing because most people with sense were heading the other direction. She had held it for the rest of her life without ever developing it, without ever explaining why she held it, without ever selling it, despite approaches over the years from people who wanted it, though. What those people wanted with 40 acres of rock and scrub in the high country had never been entirely clear to anyone. It had a cave. Wren knew that much. Agnes had mentioned it once in the offhand way she mentioned things she considered important, but did not want to make a production of the way she had taught Wren to sharpen a blade, or to read the sky for weather, or to trust the information in her own hands over the opinions of people who had not done the work themselves. There is a cave on that property, Agnes had said. Good deep stone, stays the same temperature, summer and winter both. Wren had been 11 years old and had not thought about it again until now. The town of Ridgecrest occupied a single main street that ran north to south between a white-painted church at one end and a saloon at the other. In between the usual collection of frontier commerce, the blacksmith, the livery, the post office, the lawyer's narrow office with its single dusty window. And in the middle, occupying the most prominent position on the street, the way a man of consequence occupies the most prominent chair in a room, Hale's General Mercantile. Orson Hale had run the store for 22 years. He was a man of 55 with round spectacles and the careful measuring eyes of a man who has spent 2 decades watching the frontier separate the practical from the impractical and had developed strong opinions about which category most things fell into. He was not unkind. He was simply a man who believed the world rewarded clear thinking and punished wishful ones, and who had delivered enough bad news in his time to have lost the capacity for softening it. The bell above the door rang when Wren pushed it open. The smell of the store hit her immediately, cured meats and dry goods and leather, and the faint, sweet undertone of molasses from the barrel near the back wall. The smell of provision, of the distance between those who had enough and those who did not. Orson looked up from behind the counter. He took in her face and her traveling coat and the leather pouch in her hand, and his expression settled into something that was not unkind, but was not quite compassionate either. The expression of a man preparing to deliver a diagnosis he had delivered before and did not expect to get easier with repetition. Rafe Muldoon was in the store, leaning against the shelving near the back with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back on his head. He was a trapper, 40 years old, built like someone had assembled him from spare parts that did not quite match, long arms, short torso, hands that looked like they belonged to a man twice his size. He had a beard that had not been trimmed since spring and eyes that were sharp and missed nothing. The eyes of a man who made his living reading signs and landscapes that most people walk through without seeing it all. Wren laid the deed on Orson's counter. Orson picked it up. He held it to the light. He rubbed the paper between his thumb and forefinger as though texture might tell him something the words could not. The old Hollow Rock claim, he said, and the way he said it, carried the quiet sorrow of a doctor naming an illness that both parties in the room already know has no cure. He set the deed down and looked at her. "This is less than nothing," he said. "I say that not to be cruel. I say it because it is the truth, and I think you are a young woman who deserves the truth. It is a tax burden. 40 acres of rock and ravine in the high country with no water to speak of, not any that anyone has ever found, and the only thing it has ever been reliably good for is giving rattlesnakes somewhere to be out of the sun." He gestured at the shelves behind him. $17 will buy you a stagecoach ticket east. Denver may be further. A mill town. There is work in the mill towns for a capable young woman. That is the practical play. Rafe Muldoon shifted against the shelf. "I have trapped that country 20 years, he said. There is nothing up there but rock and hard luck." Listen to Orson. He was not being cruel either. He was being what he was, a man who had spent 2 decades in the wilderness and considered himself an authority on what the wilderness contained and did not contain. He was stating a fact as he understood it. The fact happened to be wrong, but he did not know that yet. Wren stood in the center of the store and felt their judgment settle on her shoulders like weight. She looked at the shelves, at all that warmth and security arranged in its neat rows, priced just high enough to remind you that security was a transaction. She looked at the coins in her palm. A ticket east meant becoming a stranger in a city with nothing. It meant spending whatever she had left surviving long enough to find work. It meant giving up the one thing in the world that carried her name. And it meant ignoring the last words her father had spoken to her, which she did not yet understand, but which she was not prepared to discard. She looked up. "I need a good axe," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not waver. "A bow saw, 50 pounds of flour, a block of salt, dried beans, whatever the rest will buy." The silence that followed was the particular silence of people revising their assumptions in real time. Rafe's mouth opened slightly. Orson removed his spectacles, cleaned them on his apron, and replaced them. The problem looked exactly the same through clean glass. He did the arithmetic on a piece of brown paper, his pencil moving in the quiet. "This will leave you with nearly nothing," he said. Wren looked at him steadily. "I am already there," she said, and she pushed the coins across the worn wood of the counter. He packed her supplies without further comment. The flour sack was heavy. The axe handle was smooth and new, the blade bright. The saw gleamed. Wren gathered them, balanced the weight across her back and in her hands, and turned toward the door. She felt a hand touch hers. Dorothea Hale had come from behind the counter. She was a woman of 50, quiet in the way that certain frontier women were quiet, not from absence of thought, but from an excess of it, from having learned over decades that most of what needed saying never got said anyway, and that action was a more reliable language than words. She pressed a small cloth bundle into Wren's palm. Wren opened it. Seeds, wrapped in brown paper labeled in careful handwriting. Carrot, lettuce. Dorothea said nothing. She simply held Wren's gaze for one long moment, a gaze that contained something complicated, something with an edge of recognition in it, as though she were seeing not just the girl in front of her, but some older shape behind her, some outline she had encountered before in a different form. Then she turned back to her work. Wren stepped into the street. The bell rang behind her, and a question lodged itself in her mind like a splinter, small, uncomfortable, insistent. Why had Dorothea done that? What did the woman know? But there was no time to stand in the street and wonder. The sky to the west was already thickening with early cloud, and the high country waited at the end of a long road she had never traveled, and the deed in her coat pocket was either the most worthless piece of paper in Colorado or something else entirely, and she would not know which until she got there. She had not gone 20 steps when another question surfaced, rising through everything else, like something that had been waiting for the noise to settle before making itself heard. "Don't sell that land," her father's voice in the early morning, the whispered urgency of a man who had been defeated but had not stopped knowing things. She shifted the weight of the flour sack on her shoulders and walked. The journey to the Hollow Rock claim took 2 full days. The first day was the valley-packed dirt roads giving way to wagon tracks, then to paths, then to no path at all as the land began to climb. The dark, workable soil of the lower country gave way gradually to something harder and less forgiving. The trees thinned, the grass grew sparse and dry brown at the edges, clinging to the rocky soil with the stubborn tenacity of things that have learned to survive on very little. The air changed as the elevation increased, crisper, thinner, carrying a clarity that was almost painful after the close warmth of the valley. The weight on her back was a constant grinding pressure that forced her to stop every quarter mile and rest against whatever rock or stump offered itself. She had not carried this much weight this far before. Her shoulders began to ache within the first hour. By the end of the first day, they were bruised purple beneath the pack straps, and every step required a conscious negotiation with the part of her body that wanted very badly to simply stop. She did not stop. She rested and then continued rested and continued the rhythm of it, becoming mechanical by late afternoon, her mind going to a place beyond pain that was not quite numbness and not quite peace, but something functional between the two. She saw no other human being. The land at this elevation was empty in a way that went beyond solitude. It was a geological emptiness, the emptiness of country that had never been settled, never been shaped by human hands, never been named or claimed or loved in the particular way that people love the land they work. The rocks thrust up from the earth at angles that suggested violence, as though the ground itself had been broken and reassembled by a force that did not care about symmetry or the comfort of the things that would later try to live here. She made camp that first night in the lee of a boulder, her back against stone that still held the fading warmth of the afternoon sun. She built no fire, afraid of drawing attention, though there was no one for miles in any direction. She sat with her knife across her knees and listened to coyotes singing their long, wavering songs somewhere below her in the dark. She reached into her pack for something to eat, and her fingers found the book. She had not put it there. She knew immediately that she had not put it there, knew it with the certainty of someone who had packed that bag with the focused attention of a person who understands that what she carries and what she leaves behind may be the difference between living and not. She pulled the book out. The small leather volume cracked at the spine, smelling of the shelf it had lived on her whole life. Agnes Calloway's book. Cale's book. Tucked inside the front cover was a scrap of paper. She held it toward the faint, ambient light of the overcast sky and read the words written there in her brother's careful, slightly cramped handwriting. "I know you will be okay, B." She read it twice. Then she pressed the paper against her chest and allowed herself to cry. She gave herself 3 minutes. She had decided this before she left, had decided it the way you decide the terms of a difficult contract, with full awareness that the terms exist to protect you from yourself. 3 minutes of shaking, silent grief, her face pressed into the crook of her arm so the sound would not carry in the clear mountain air. Then she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She folded the note with the same care she would have used to fold a piece of legal paper containing something important. She placed it in the breast pocket of her dress against her heart. She checked the position of the stars through a gap in the clouds to confirm her heading. Grief was a luxury. 3 minutes was what she could afford. The second day was harder than the first in every way that mattered. Her shoulders, which had begun as bruised, had moved into a deeper register of pain. The blisters on her feet had opened and reopened until each step was a negotiation conducted in a language of pure sensation that left no room for anything else. The landscape had transformed completely from the valley country she had grown up in. The trees up here were sparse and twisted, shaped by decades of wind into forms that looked like the frozen gestures of old men reaching for things just out of reach. She passed the ruins of a prospector's camp. Nothing but a ring of blackened stones and a few rotted timbers collapsed inward on themselves, slowly being absorbed back into the earth. Whoever had come here had not stayed. The mountain had outlasted them as it outlasted everything. She looked at those rotted timbers for a moment, at the proof of someone else's failure, at the circle of blackened stones that had once held a fire that once held a life, and then she kept walking. In the early afternoon of the second day, she climbed a low ridge and stopped. Below her, the land fell away into a broken maze of ravines and dry washes. The scale of it was enormous, miles of shattered rock and thin scrub, and the pale marks of seasonal water running through channels that were dry now and had been dry for months. She could see the faint thread of the trail behind her, leading back toward Ridgecrest, back toward stagecoach tickets and milled towns, and the anonymous safety of giving up. She stood there for a long time. Her body was a catalog of protest, every muscle, every joint, every blister, speaking at once in the same insistent language. Turn around. This is foolishness. The man in the store was right. The trapper was right. Everyone who has ever looked at this piece of paper and shaken their head was right. But turn around to what? The door was latched. There was no home behind her. There was only forward, and forward meant a piece of paper and a hole in the ground. And whatever lay between her and the moment she found out which of those things it actually was. And there was her father's voice, thin as thread, but present, "Don't sell that land." She descended. By evening she found it. A sheer face of gray, weathered granite rose from the earth like the prow of some enormous buried ship thrusting up out of the hillside with the absolute confidence of something that has been exactly where it is for 100 million years and intends to remain there for 100 million more. The stone was smooth in places, scarred in others, streaked with the dark stains of old water that no longer ran. And at its base, in the angle where the cliff met the slope, a dark opening in the rock. Perhaps 5 feet wide at the entrance, tapering slightly on one side. A cave. This was it. This was the sum of everything. The hollow rock claim. Her inheritance. The thing her grandmother had spent 40 years protecting. Wren stood in front of that dark opening and felt the full crushing weight of the moment descend on her. It hit her now with a force she had not been prepared for, not even after everything. Orson had been right. Muldoon had been right. It was a hole in a rock on a mountainside in the middle of nowhere, and she had spent the last of her money on an axe and a bag of flour to stand here and look at it. The wind, which had been her constant companion for 2 days, picked up as the sun went down, slicing through her coat, with a chill that found every gap in the fabric and every gap in her resolve. There was no other shelter, no stand of trees, no abandoned structure, nothing, just the cave. She unslung her pack. She struck her tinderbox and lit a small piece of kindling. The flame guttered in the draft. She stepped inside. The entrance tunnel was short, no more than 15 feet, and it opened quickly into a vaulted chamber that swallowed her small light and gave back only echoes. She stopped just inside the entrance and held the flame high. The walls were smooth, not broken and jagged the way she had expected, not the rough-edged darkness she had imagined during 2 days of walking toward it, but curved and polished, shaped by water over millennia, into a dull sheen that caught the firelight and threw it back in soft amber curves as though the stone itself were luminous from within. The ceiling arched overhead like the nave of a church, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of her small flame. The floor was a mix of sand and fine gravel, perfectly dry, undisturbed by anything except the slow passage of time. There was a smell, faint but distinct, the mineral scent of deep earth of rock that had never seen sunlight of water, that had traveled through miles of stone before arriving here. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of permanence. She walked deeper, her flame pushing back the dark in a small moving circle. The cave seemed to breathe a slow, almost imperceptible movement of air that stirred her flame without extinguishing it, as though the mountain were drawing breath and releasing it in a cycle that had been repeating since before the first human foot touched this continent. Then she felt it. A shift. The temperature changed not dramatically, not the warmth of a heated room, but something subtler and more significant. Steady, consistent, cool without being cold. Completely, utterly sheltered from the wind that was now tearing at the landscape outside with increasing fury. Inside these walls the air was still. The roar of the wind above was reduced to a murmur, then to silence, then to nothing. She stood in that stillness for a moment and breathed. Then she heard it. So quiet she had to hold her own breath to be certain it was real. A sound beneath the silence below the threshold of normal hearing, emerging only when everything else stopped. Slow, rhythmic, patient, a drip. She followed the sound deeper into the chamber, moving carefully in the shifting light, until she found it a narrow fissure in the far wall of the cave, perhaps 2 inches wide. From it, a single drop of water emerged, caught the firelight for one bright instant, and fell with a clear resonant note into a shallow depression in the stone below. A natural basin worn smooth over centuries of this same slow dripping, holding perhaps a cup of water at a time crystal clear. She knelt. She cupped her hand beneath the slow drip and waited until she had enough to drink. The water was cold and clean, without any taste of iron or sulfur, without anything but the faint mineral whisper of the stone it had traveled through to arrive here. She drank. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. She pressed her palm flat against the cave wall. The stone beneath her hand radiated a deep, slow coolness. Not the biting cold of the outside air, but the steady thermal mass of millions of tons of granite that had spent the summer absorbing heat and would spend the winter releasing it degree by patient degree for as long as the winter lasted. This was what no one had bothered to discover because no one had bothered to come inside and pay attention. This was not a grave. This was a fortress, a root cellar, a buffer against the killing cold, a source of water in a county where water was the difference between life and everything else. The despair that had gripped her minutes before drained away. What replaced it was not joy, not relief, not anything warm. What replaced it was something harder and colder and more useful than any of those things, a focused, grim resolve, the resolve of a person who has just discovered that the ground under their feet is solid after all. Not comfortable, not forgiving, not easy, but solid. Something to stand on, something to build from. She set her pack down against the cave wall. She ate a handful of dry beans and a piece of flatbread, sitting cross-legged on the cave floor, with her small flame burning steady in the still air. That was when her boot touched it. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just the soft resistance of a boot encountering something hard beneath an inch of fine sand, something with corners, something manufactured, something that did not belong to the natural world of the cave. She set her flame on a nearby rock and dug with her hands, brushing sand aside with the careful attention of someone who has learned in the past 48 hours that what looks like nothing may in fact be everything. The object revealed itself slowly. A small tin box, perhaps 6 inches long, rusted at the hinges, the lid sealed by years of damp and pressure into something that required the blade of her knife to open. She pried it. The lid gave with a soft protest of corroded metal. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of cloth that had once been calico and was now mostly rust stain and decay, were 2 things. A ring, simple silver, tarnished to near black, a woman's ring, and a piece of paper so old and fragile that she held her breath as she unfolded it, working with the edges of her fingernails, moving so slowly that the act of opening it felt like surgery. The handwriting was shaky. The ink had faded to a ghost of itself, brown where it had once been black, absent entirely in places where moisture had done its slow, patient work over years. But she recognized it. She would have recognized it anywhere, the particular way the letters leaned slightly to the right, the way the capital letters were larger than strictly necessary, the habit her grandmother had of pressing the pen harder on important words, so they were slightly darker than the rest. Agnes Calloway's hand. She tilted the paper toward the flame and read what she could. Most of it was gone. Decades of darkness and the slow chemistry of damp paper had consumed the majority of whatever Agnes had written here, left only fragments stranded on the page, like survivors of a shipwreck, isolated and partial and achingly suggestive of the whole that no longer existed. The water will never run dry. A gap of illegible words. Beneath the stone is life. More gaps. Do not let the Grundy family. And then nothing. The rest had been eaten entirely. Wren read the fragments 3 times. Then she sat very still in the firelight of her grandmother's cave on her grandmother's land, holding her grandmother's words in her hands, and felt the full meaning of what she had found settle over her like weather. Grundy, the same Grundy whose smooth voice had risen through the floorboards of her father's house 2 nights ago and shaped the sentence that sent her here. The same Grundy who held her father's debt. The same Grundy who had mentioned in the casual tone of a man noting something of minor interest that the Hollow Rock claim had tax debt accumulating and that he would be willing to help with that burden. Agnes Calloway had known something about this land, something specific enough to write down, something important enough to hide at the deepest accessible point of the cave, something that involved the Grundy family in a way that had clearly alarmed her. And her father had known too. Not everything, not the details, perhaps not the full shape of it, but enough to whisper those words at the door before she crossed the threshold. Oh, don't sell that land. The words of a man who understood he was sending his daughter into something larger than a simple inheritance dispute and who had no power to explain it, but could not let her go without the warning. The fire crackled in the still air of the cave. Outside, the wind moved across the high country, with the indifference of forces that have been in motion since long before human beings arrived to be troubled by them. The mountain did not care about Silas Grundy or Agnes Calloway or a girl of 18 sitting on its floor reading a dead woman's warning by firelight. But the mountain held water. And in a dry county in a drought year, in a place where the difference between a thriving cattle ranch and a failed one came down in the end to who controlled the water, that was not a small thing. Wren wrapped the tin box carefully in her spare dress and placed it at the bottom of her pack beneath everything else. The questions it raised were enormous. The implications were things she could not yet fully see the shape of, could only sense around the edges, the way you sense the size of a room in the dark by the quality of the echo. But winter was coming. The first snows would reach the high peaks within weeks. She needed walls. She needed a door. She needed fire and food, and a system for staying alive long enough to find out what her grandmother had known and why it mattered. The mystery of Agnes Calloway would keep. The cold would not. She stood at the mouth of the cave as the last light left the sky. The darkness came on fast at this elevation, the way everything came on fast up here. Weather cold, the hard facts of survival at altitude. To the east, the first stars appeared faint and steady, the permanent ones that navigators used because they did not move. In her breast pocket, Kel's note pressed against her heart. Behind her in the darkness of the cave, water dripped its patient, endless rhythm into stone. She turned back toward the cave. There was a camp to make. There was a plan to form. There were walls to build, and a winter to survive, and a dead woman's warning to understand before the man it named arrived to finish what he had started. She had $17 and a bone-handled knife, and a grandmother's ring and a tin box, and the solid, absolute certainty that she was not going to give any of it up. The work began tomorrow. Stone and Water, Part 2. What Cannot Be Taken. Ridgecrest County, Colorado. October 1889 through January 1890. She began the next morning before the light came. There was no ceremony to it, no moment of standing at the cave entrance, looking out at the dark country below and feeling the weight of what she was undertaking. She simply woke in the blackness of the cave interior, lay still for the 10 seconds it took her body to remember where it was and why, and then rose and built a small fire at the cave entrance and heated water for the thin porridge that would be breakfast for the foreseeable future. The plan had assembled itself during the night the way plans do when the mind keeps working after the body has gone still. She had not slept deeply. The cave floor was hard and the cold came up through it in a way that no amount of repositioning fully addressed, but in the half-sleep she had drifted through the shape of what needed to happen, had clarified itself into something she could hold and examine and test against the reality of her situation. The cave was the core. That was the first principle. The temperature inside was steady in a way that no structure she could build alone would match for months. In the depths of a Colorado winter, that stability was not a comfort, it was a survival mechanism. Animals sheltered there would not freeze. Food stored there would not spoil. And if her gamble with Dorothea's seeds paid anything at all, things might grow there slowly in the dim ambient light near the entrance in soil, dark enough and moisture consistent enough to sustain life when every living thing on the surface was locked under ice. But she needed more than the cave. She needed walls between herself and the wind. She needed a fire she could maintain without running it inside a natural stone chamber, where the smoke had nowhere reliable to go. She needed a door she could lock. The cabin would be built against the cliff face, sealing the cave entrance into its back wall, creating a two-chambered system. The front room, the cabin, would face southeast to catch the morning sun. The rear chamber, the cave, would serve as storage, as shelter for whatever animals she could acquire, and eventually, if the gamble paid off, as a growing space for the seeds Dorothea had pressed into her hands, with a look that Wren was still turning over. Simple in concept, brutal in execution. She found the trees a quarter-mile down the ravine, a stand of hardy pines that had survived the drought by virtue of a slightly sheltered position and root systems deep enough to find water when the surface offered none. She had never felled a tree, but she had watched her father fell dozens of them over the course of her childhood, had stood at a distance and observed the way he read a trunk before he touched it, the lean of it, the balance, the angle of the notch cut. She had stored those observations without knowing she would ever need them, the way a person stores the words of a language they do not yet speak. Her first attempts were clumsy. The axe bit at wrong angles. The saw caught and bound in the greenwood. She wasted an hour on a trunk that a more experienced hand would have dropped in 20 minutes. But she was methodical in her failure. She examined each mistake, identified its cause, corrected it once, and did not make it again. By the third tree, she had found something that approached rhythm. By the fifth, she had found the principle: use the weight of the tool, not the strength of the arms. Let the blade do what it is designed to do. Trust the physics. When the first pine cracked and tilted and came down in an explosion of snapping branches and shaking earth, the sound of it rolled across the empty high country and came back to her as a faint echo from the cliff face above. The sound of something beginning. Hauling the logs was a different problem entirely. She could not lift them, not full trunks, not even stripped of their branches. So she learned the ancient art of leverage, cutting smaller branches into rollers, laying them in a line across the uneven ground, coaxing each log forward a foot at a time, with a combination of her own body weight and whatever mechanical advantage the terrain offered. Each log was a full day's work, from the moment the tree fell to the moment the stripped timber lay near the cave entrance. By the end of the first week, a dozen of them lay in a pale row against the cliff, and her hands had been transformed. The blisters she had developed walking up from Ridgecrest had broken and reformed, and broken again, until the skin beneath had given up the pretense of being ordinary skin and had hardened into something that belonged to a different category of person entirely. Her shoulders had stopped aching with the acute pain of recent injury and had settled into a deeper, duller register, the ache of muscles being rebuilt from the foundation up, as though her body were undertaking its own construction project in parallel with the one she was managing outside. She built the stone foundation next. The high country offered no shortage of flat rock, and she spent 2 days collecting the largest flat stones she could move, levering them across the uneven ground with a thick branch that served as a pry bar, rolling them end over end where the terrain allowed, dragging them on improvised sleds of bark where it did not. She measured the perimeter with her own paces, 12 steps by 8. It would be small, a person could cross it in 3 strides, but it would have 4 walls and a roof and a door, and it would be hers. The work had a rhythm. She surrendered to the way a swimmer surrenders to a current moving in the right direction. Lift, carry, place, adjust. The repetition emptied her mind of everything except the immediate physical reality of stone and muscle and gravity. When her hands were full and her back was bent and every ounce of attention was absorbed by the angle at which a particular stone needed to sit, there was no room left for anything else. No room for grief, no room for the memory of a latch clicking shut. The work did not heal any of those things. It postponed them. On the frontier, postponement was the closest thing to grace that most people ever received. She notched each log at both ends using a method she invented and revised again over the course of the first wall. The first wall took 4 days. By the fourth wall, she had brought that down to 2. She constructed a crude lifting frame from a forked branch and her rope anchored to a juniper near the cave entrance that allowed her to raise each timber into position through a combination of leverage and the absolute refusal to accept that it could not be done. The work was dangerous in the way that solitary frontier work is always dangerous, not dramatically, not with obvious menace, but with a quiet, constant potential for catastrophe that required perpetual attention to prevent. A log rolling free of its notch, a rope slipping its anchor. Any of these things in isolation on a construction site with other people present would be an inconvenience. Here alone, they would be the last thing that happened to her. She understood this with her body rather than her mind, with the instinctive caution of an animal that has assessed its environment and identified the rules for surviving it. After 12 days of this work, 4 rough walls stood against the gray face of the cliff. They were not beautiful. The gaps between the logs admitted thin, cold fingers of wind that whistled through the interior and carried with them the sharp announcement of approaching winter. But the structure had integrity. It was plumb. It was square. It was the first thing she had ever built entirely with her own hands. And when she stood inside it and looked up at the rectangle of pale Colorado sky visible through the unfinished roof, she felt something she had no adequate name for. Not pride exactly, something quieter and more durable. The feeling of having answered a question correctly, a question the world had asked of her with considerable hostility and without offering any particular assistance. The chinking came next. She mixed sandy soil from the cave floor with water from the drip and dried grasses she harvested from the ravine, chopping them into short lengths and working them into the mixture until it had the consistency of something that would hold. She packed it into every gap with her bare hands, her fingers going numb, in the wet cold, the chill working up through her wrists and into the bones of her forearms. It was miserable work. It was necessary work. As the gaps filled, the cabin transformed. The wind, which had been treating the structure as an inconvenience to pass through on its way somewhere else, was stopped. The interior quieted, stilled. The space began to feel less like a collection of logs and more like a room. The fireplace required the full extent of what she knew and a considerable amount of what she did not. She identified a section of the cliff face that would serve as the back wall of the cabin and began constructing a hearth from the flattest stones she could find, binding them with her mud mortar and fashioning a flue that vented upward through a natural fissure in the rock. A narrow crack she spent an entire day widening with her knife and a heavy stone chipping at granite until her vision blurred and her arms refused to lift. The first time she lit a fire, the cabin filled with smoke. It poured from the hearth in thick, choking clouds that drove her out the door, gasping, her eyes streaming, standing in the cold, while the wind stripped the tears from her face almost before they formed. She gave the despair 30 seconds. Then she went back inside. She found the blockage, a shelf of stone inside the fissure where debris had accumulated over years and sealed the natural draft. She cleared it with her knife, rebuilt the upper section of the chimney with smaller, more carefully fitted stones, adjusted the angle of the opening. She lit the fire again. The smoke hesitated, swirled, then drew upward in a thin gray column that disappeared into the rock above. A crackle, a glow, and then heat steady and radiant, pushing back the cold the way sunrise pushes back the dark. She sat before those flames and felt the warmth reach into her body, then into the bruised muscles and the cracked skin and the deep bone-level exhaustion of weeks of relentless labor. And the feeling that moved through her was so complete that it eclipsed everything else. Every blister, every doubt, every night on cold stone with nothing but determination and the small, folded note in her breast pocket for company. She had fire. She had walls. She had water. Now she needed the cave to earn its purpose. She began hauling soil from a sheltered pocket in the ravine below dark composted earth that had accumulated in a depression where organic matter had been collecting and breaking down for years, building up a richness that the rocky, high country soil entirely lacked. Trip after trip with her tin bucket, she built raised beds against the front wall of the cave where the ambient light from the entrance would be strongest. In those beds, she pressed Dorothea's seeds, the carrots, the lettuce, into the cool, dark earth, with fingers that were gentle for the first time in weeks. It was a desperate gamble. She had no evidence that anything could grow in these conditions. No sunlight worth speaking of, temperatures that held steady at cool, rather than warm soil that had never seen a cultivated seed. But the temperature was consistent, the moisture was reliable, and the soil was dark and rich in a way that surface soil in this country, baked and leached by decades of hard weather, simply was not. If anything could grow through a Colorado winter, she believed it would grow here. She sectioned the rest of the cave into animal pens, weaving low fences from thin saplings and strips of bark, creating spaces that were small but functional. The space was ready. All it needed was something alive to fill it. It was in the third week of November, when the first real cold had settled into the high country and the mornings began with a thin skim of ice on the water in her bucket, that she made the walk back to Ridgecrest. Her body had changed in the weeks since she had last walked this road. She was leaner, harder, stripped of everything that was not functional. Her hands were unrecognizable as the hands she had carried into Hale's Mercantile 6 weeks ago, calloused and scarred, the nails cracked and darkened, gripping her axe handle with an ease that would have been impossible to her former self. The town looked smaller than she remembered. That happened, she had heard, when you spent time in open country. The scale recalibrated, in what had once seemed substantial, revealed itself as provisional, temporary, a collection of wooden structures standing in the open country and trying to pass for permanence. The bell rang when she pushed into Hale's Mercantile. Orson looked up from behind the counter, and his eyebrows performed a slow climb toward his hairline. "Well," he said, "the cave dweller returns. I had begun to assume the coyotes had settled the question." Rafe Muldoon was there, as though he lived in the store, occupying his usual position near the back with his arms crossed. He looked her over with the frank appraisal of a man who assesses things for a living. Then he straightened slightly, a small, involuntary adjustment, as though what he was seeing required a different posture than what he had expected. "Winter is about to get serious," he said. "That hole in the rock won't save you when the real cold hits." Wren walked to the counter and met Orson's eyes. "I need 4 laying hens and a breeding pair of sheep," she said. "A ewe and a ram, another 50 pounds of salt." Orson let out a slow breath. He knew exactly what she had started with. He could calculate the arithmetic of her situation to the penny. "That is everything you have left," he said. "The animals alone." "That is my concern," Wren said, and placed her remaining bills and coins on the counter. He counted it twice. Then he filled the order without further comment. Some arguments, his expression suggested, were not worth the energy of having. She was leading her small flock through the main street of Ridgecrest when she heard it, a whisper carried on the cold air with the particular clarity that cold air lends to sound. "Poor thing, she has lost her mind entirely." She kept walking. The opinions of others were a currency she could not spend, and therefore could not afford to carry. At the edge of town, a figure stepped into the road. Constance Pruitt was nearly 70 years old. Her back had taken on the curve that comes from decades of frontier life, the slow compression of a spine that has carried too much for too long, but her eyes were sharp and bright and missed nothing. She planted her cane in the packed dirt of the road and stood in it the way a stone stands in a stream, and Wren stopped. "You are Agnes Calloway's granddaughter," Constance said. It was not a question. She studied Wren's face with the careful attention of someone reading a document to verify its authenticity. Then, apparently satisfied with what she found, she spoke. Her voice was low, her eyes moving once to the street behind them before she continued. "Your grandmother was not a fool for holding that land. She knew something about it that this whole town has never bothered to find out. And the Grundy family knows it too. That is why they want it." She pressed a cloth-wrapped bundle into Wren's hand. Inside was a piece of paper folded many times, soft with age. Wren unfolded it carefully. A map, hand-drawn in ink, faded to sepia, showing the interior of a cave in far more detail than Wren had yet explored. There were passages she had not found, chambers she had not entered, markings in Agnes's hand's second water source. Inner chamber, a location marked with an X and a notation too faded to read. "Agnes drew that," Constance said. "She gave it to me for safekeeping 30 years ago, told me that one day someone would need it." She paused. "I am giving you the map today. When the time comes, and you will know when the time comes, there is more that I have kept for you, Bemero. But that is for another day. Today you need to get those animals up the mountain before this cold turns serious." She looked at the sky to the west at the thickening cloud on the horizon. Silas Grundy has been trying to acquire Hollow Rock for 3 decades, not because of the surface acreage, because of what is underneath. There is a water source beneath that cave, a subsurface spring that feeds into the water table for the entire valley. In dry country like this, whoever controls that source controls every cattle operation within 20 miles. Agnes understood that. She refused to sell at any price. When she died, Grundy believed his opportunity had finally arrived. The debt he arranged with your father, the years of drought, the pressure to send you away, none of that happened by accident. She placed her cane firmly on the ground and turned. Go, she said simply. Go and build what needs building. I will be here when you need me. Wren stood in the road for a moment, the map in her hands, and the full architecture of what had happened to her family assembling itself in her mind with a clarity that was almost physical. She could see it now, the whole structure of it log by deliberate log. The loans extended at terms designed for failure. 3 years of debt accumulating to a number that could never be repaid. The quiet suggestion about the Hollow Rock tax debt, the implication that a young woman with nothing should take the practical path east and leave the land behind. Not misfortune, architecture. She folded the map, placed it inside her dress next to Cale's note, and continued walking. The sheep followed. The chickens clucked in their crate. The road climbed toward the high country and Ridgecrest fell away behind her. 3 days after she returned with the animals, she found the second chamber. She had been studying the map each evening by firelight, comparing its notations against what she had explored, working from the entrance inward. The passage Agnes had marked was a narrow gap in the rear wall of the main chamber, easy to overlook. She had glanced at it twice in her first explorations and dismissed it as a dead-end crack in the rock. But the map was specific. She turned sideways and pressed through the stone tight against her chest and back, breathing out to make herself narrower. She emerged into a different world. The second chamber was smaller than the first, but with a higher ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. The air was different here. There was a sound in it, not the slow, rhythmic drip of the outer room, but something fuller, something with more presence. She moved her lantern toward the far wall. It was not a drip, it was a flow. A thin but continuous stream of water emerged from a fissure in the rock 6 feet above the floor, ran down the wall in a dark ribbon, and collected in a natural basin carved into the stone. Perhaps 2 feet across, a foot deep, the water clear and cold and moving constantly replenished. Never still, she knelt beside it and put her hand into the stream. The cold went through her palm and up her wrist and into her arm like something alive. This was what Agnes had protected for 40 years. This was what Silas Grundy had built a 30-year campaign to acquire. Not the surface land, not the cave itself. This continuous drought-proof, season-independent source of water running through the rock of the high country and feeding into the water table of the entire valley below. In a county where every cattle rancher's survival depended on water access, where a single reliable source could mean the difference between a thriving operation and a failed one. This spring was worth more than any surface acreage in Ridgecrest County. It was worth more than the Grundy Ranch itself. Wren sat beside that pool for a long time in the lantern light. The map had led her here. Agnes had drawn it and hidden it and given it to Constance for safekeeping because she understood that the land would outlast her and the fight for it would outlast her, and whoever came after her would need to know where to look. She was not a girl trying to survive a winter anymore. She was the guardian of something that powerful men wanted, and she was going to have to fight to keep it, not with weapons, not with force, but with patience, with planning, and with the willingness to endure conditions that others would not. She returned to the main chamber, sat by the fire, and began to think seriously about the months ahead. December settled over the high country like a sentence being completed. The sky became a permanent gray ceiling, pressing down on the peaks until they disappeared into cloud, and the world contracted to the size of what you could see from your own door. Her days fell into a rhythm that left no room for anything but necessity. Morning stoked the fire, checked the animals in the cave water, the garden beds from the inner chamber, spring collect whatever eggs the hens had produced. The eggs were small miracles, warm in her cold hands, proof that the system she had built was producing something beyond its own maintenance. The lettuce had come up pale and slow, pressing through the dark soil in the cave with the stubborn deliberation of life insisting on itself against considerable odds. The carrots were slower still, but their green hair was beginning to show at the soil surface, thin and tentative, and absolutely real. Then the rest of the day, firewood repairs the endless minor maintenance of a structure built from improvised materials by a single pair of hands. She sharpened the axe. She reinforced the door hinges. She was utterly alone, and yet she was not lonely because the work filled every space and every moment and left no room for the feeling to take hold. One evening deep in December, she opened Agnes's book and read aloud. Not to anyone in particular. To the sheep breathing on the other side of the cave wall. To the darkness. To herself. Her voice sounded strange and too loud in the quiet of the cabin, as though the silence had been there long enough to develop a preference for itself. She stopped in the middle of a page. "Kale," she said quietly, "I miss you." No answer. Only the fire and the wind above, and somewhere deep in the cave, the steady sound of water meeting stone. She closed the book. She banked the fire. She lay down on her cot and slept, and in the morning she began again. It was in the last week of January that Fletcher Grundy came. He arrived on horseback with a hired man beside him, whose face had the quality of a clenched fist tight without expression, the face of a man paid to be present rather than to think. Fletcher was 22 years old and carried himself with the ease of someone who had grown up understanding that the world would arrange itself around him. He wore a leather coat that was too clean and too expensive for the country he was riding through, and he dismounted near the cabin with the casual confidence of someone entering a space he considered in some fundamental sense already his. He looked at the cabin, at the solid walls, the stone chimney, the cleared ground. Something shifted in his expression, a recalibration he tried to hide and did not entirely succeed at. He had expected something more provisional, something more desperate. "My father sends his regards," Fletcher said. His voice carried the polished, false warmth of someone who has rehearsed his lines and knows they are good. "He heard you had taken up residence here. Wanted me to check in as a neighborly gesture." He paused, allowing the word to settle. "He also wanted me to remind you that this property carries 3 years of unpaid county tax. If it is not settled before the end of March, the county will seize it and sell at auction. My father would be willing to purchase it at that point." He tilted his head with an expression of practiced sympathy. "The amount currently owed is $12. You don't have $12, do you?" "This land is mine," Wren said. She held up the deed, the same yellowed paper her father had pressed into her hand on that September morning. Her voice was level and carried nothing in it that Fletcher could use. Fletcher shrugged with the easy indifference of a man holding cards he knows cannot be beaten. "Legally, sure. Until March." He swung back onto his horse and looked down at her from the added height with the particular satisfaction of a person delivering bad news they have been looking forward to delivering. "Winter is not kind up here," he said. "My father is a patient man. The season is not." He turned the horse and rode away, the hired man following without having spoken a single word. Wren stood in the cold and watched the dust of their departure settle on the frozen ground and felt the equation of her situation shift. $12. She calculated it immediately the way she calculated everything now, fast and without sentiment. What she had. What she could earn before March from the small trades she had begun conducting with the neighboring families who had started making the trek to her door. Eggs in the dead of winter were remarkable enough that word had traveled. Pale winter vegetables grown somewhere unknown had added to the story. Clean, sweet water offered in tin cups to anyone who climbed the trail. The mathematics were not good. $12 by March was a number designed to be just beyond what she could reach. She did not know yet that the number was invented. She did not know yet that $5 had been added with surgical precision to guarantee her failure. But something in her knew the number was wrong. She could feel it the way she felt changes in the weather, not through specific information, but through the accumulated experience of paying attention to the way things actually are versus the way certain people describe them. She went inside. She sat by the fire for a long time. Then she picked up the axe and went out to split the next day's firewood, working in the cold dusk with strokes that were harder than necessary and more deliberate than anything the wood required. The storm announced itself 3 nights later. She felt it first through the floor of the cave, a low vibration in the rock itself, more sensation than sound, something that settled in her back teeth and the soles of her feet with the subtlety of a warning delivered by the landscape rather than any person. She had been living in close enough contact with this mountain for 4 months that she had begun to understand something of its language, the The specific groan of the cabin walls when the temperature dropped sharply, the particular quality of silence that preceded heavy snowfall, the way the animals in the cave grew restless hours before any weather she could see or hear. This was different from all of those. This was the mountain speaking in a lower register. This was the voice it used for serious things. She went to the window and looked out. The world had gone unnaturally still. No wind, no sound of any kind. The sky to the west was a darkness that was not the ordinary darkness of night, but something denser, something pressing down. When the snow began, it did not drift. It drove. Small, hard flakes moving horizontally propelled by a wind that came from nothing to a full scream in the space of an hour. The temperature, already cold, dropped with a violence that was physical. She could feel it working through the cabin walls, pressing inward, probing for weakness, the way a serious enemy probes a defensive line. She secured the door with the heavy brace log. She checked the fire. She moved through the cave, checking the animals, filling every container she had from the inner chamber spring. The sheep were restless. The hens had tucked their heads and gone still. The water ran on in stone basin without any acknowledgement that the world above it was dissolving into chaos. Then the window went white, not gradually. In what seemed like minutes, the snow packed against the glass and covered it entirely, and the cabin plunged into a firelit twilight that was its own kind of comfort. It sealed, compressed. The outside world reduced to an abstraction of sound. The roar of the wind was extraordinary, a constant high-pitched fury that had no pause and no variation, like standing inside a bell being struck without end. And then something remarkable happened. The tons of snow piling against the outer walls began to work in her favor. The insulation effect was immediate and measurable. The drafts that had persisted through even the best chinked gaps simply stopped. The cabin sealed itself in a cocoon of compressed white, and inside the fire crackled with steady indifference to the violence being conducted a few feet away. She walked into the cave. The storm did not exist here. There was no sound of wind, no sense of the fury outside. The sheep chewed with placid contentment. The chickens slept. The water dripped and flowed in its ancient rhythm as it had dripped and flowed through every storm this mountain had ever endured, without hurry and without pause. She was not fighting the storm. She was outside its reach entirely. She had been sitting with this quiet satisfaction for perhaps 2 hours when the sound came, so faint at first that she dismissed it as a branch against the cabin wall, as any of a dozen things that the noise of a serious storm could produce. But it came again, and the second time she heard it clearly for what it was: a fist against her door. Irregular, desperate weakening with each blow. Nothing natural made that sound. That was a human being at the absolute end of their endurance, spending the last of what they had on the only door left in the world. She crossed the cabin silently and stood at the door with the iron poker in her hand. Her first instinct was the instinct of someone who has spent 4 months learning that the difference between alive and not was the integrity of her system. Opening that door meant letting in the storm. It meant sharing food calculated to last one person. It meant compressing every margin she had built between herself and catastrophe. The fist struck the door again. Weaker now, she stood with her hand on the brace log and conducted the internal argument that lasted 10 seconds and felt like an hour. Survival is not a prize to be hoarded. It is a state to be shared when sharing is possible. The people freezing outside had been wrong about her. They had been dismissive and unkind. But being wrong about someone is not a death sentence, and she was not the kind of person who would make it one. She lifted the log and pulled the door open. A figure collapsed across the threshold in a cascade of driven snow and frozen air. She threw her weight against the door and forced it shut. Then she turned to what was on her floor. She dragged the body toward the fire. As the snow and ice melted from the face, she recognized him. The beard, the big mismatched hands, the trapper's coat. Rafe Muldoon, the man who had told her there was nothing up here but rock and hard luck. He was barely conscious. His lips were cracked and white, his skin the gray-blue of a man whose body has begun making hard decisions about what to warm and what to let go cold. His words came in fragments. Wagon overturned. Orson and his wife lost them in the white. Saw your smoke through a break in the wind. Thought I was seeing things. The cold knot in Wren's chest was immediate and precise. Not one life. 3. She wrapped Rafe in her only spare blanket and pressed a cup of hot broth into his hands. Then she stood in the center of her warm firelit cabin and faced the full arithmetic of what she was about to do. Her food stores were calculated for one person through the end of winter, firewood rationed by the day. 3 additional people would consume in a week what she had planned to last a month. These were the people who had called her a fool, the man who had told her to take the stagecoach east, the trapper who had predicted her death with casual confidence, the woman who had given her seeds without explanation, whose husband had added up her coins with the expression of a man doing arithmetic on a foregone conclusion. She thought all of this. She held it clearly and did not flinch from it. Then she dressed in every layer she owned. She pulled her scarf across her face until only her eyes showed. She took the lantern, a coil of rope, and what remained of the stew in a sealed pot. She tied the rope around her waist and anchored the other end to the boulder beside the cabin door. Then she opened the door and stepped into the storm. The wind struck her like a wall. It drove ice into the strip of exposed skin around her eyes with the force of thrown sand and tried to take the lantern from her hand before she had taken 3 steps. The snow was waist-deep in places, thigh-deep in others, a treacherous powder concealing the uneven ground underneath. Each step was a battle. Each breath was a negotiation with air that seemed more cold than oxygen. She kept the cliff face to her left, her shoulder against the stone, using it as the only fixed reference in the blinding white. Without it, she would have been lost within seconds. The cold was predatory. It found the gaps in her clothing with precision and went to work on the flesh underneath, numbing her extremities first, then working inward. She could feel her fingers going first, then her toes, the cold conducting its systematic withdrawal from the outer provinces of her body toward the core. She had perhaps 30 minutes before the cold began to compromise her thinking. Perhaps 30 more after that before it compromised everything else. She did not think about this. She counted her steps and felt the granite under her left hand and forced each foot forward. The rope behind her played out yard by hard yard, her lifeline, the one connection between the world she had built and the white annihilation surrounding her. She found them because of the wagon. The dark angular shape of its overturned bed was wrong, in a world where everything else was soft and curved a hard line in a landscape of formlessness. She brought her lantern up, and the light fell on 2 figures pressed against the wood, sheltered from the worst of the wind by nothing more than the accident of the wagon's position. Orson Hale's face, when the light found it, wore pure disbelief. His wife Dorothea was pressed against him, her eyes closed, her body shaking with a violence that had moved beyond ordinary shivering into something more fundamental, the shaking of a body burning its last reserves. Another hour in the cold would have finished what the storm had started. There was no time for words. Wren pressed the pot of hot stew into Orson's hands, got under Dorothea's arm, and took the woman's weight and gestured toward the rope with her lantern. They followed it, step by step, foot by foot, through snow that tried to hold them and waned, that tried to take them apart. When they came through the door, and she got it shut behind them, the silence and warmth struck all 3 of them like something physical. Orson swayed in the center of the room. His eyes moved from the fire to the stew pot to Rafe Muldoon, stirring weakly by the hearth, and his mouth opened without producing any sound. Then Wren led them through the low doorway into the cave and held the lantern high. She watched his face as the light revealed what the mountain held, the sheep standing placid in their pens, the chickens roosting on their makeshift perch, the rows of pale vegetables growing in raised beds of dark soil, green and impossible in the dead of a Colorado January, the steady flow of clean water down the inner wall into its stone basin. Orson Hale had spent 22 years in Ridgecrest County. He had seen every kind of frontier homestead. He had seen ingenuity and he had seen despair, and he had seen every variation between the two. He had never seen anything like this. He turned to Wren. The emotions moving across his face were fighting each other for dominance, awe, and shame, and a gratitude so large it had nowhere to go except outward. When he spoke, his voice broke on the first word. He had to begin again. "We were wrong," he said. "We called you a fool." He looked at the green things growing in the darkness, at the water running down the stone wall, at the fire visible through the doorway behind them. My God, we were the fools. Wren took the stew pot from his hands and ladled it into bowls without ceremony. "There is food," she said. Her voice carried nothing extra, no triumph, no bitterness, no invitation to discuss what had been said in a mercantile in September. Just the simple, solid fact of it. eat. The blizzard raged for 3 more days. The storm broke on the morning of the fourth day. It did not end dramatically. There was no single moment when the wind stopped and the sky cleared and the world announced itself renewed. It simply diminished hour by hour. The roaring subsided to a howl, the howl to a moan, the moan to the ordinary sound of wind moving through high country in winter, which was cold and constant but no longer murderous. By mid-morning, pale light was coming through the gap around the doorframe, and by noon, Wren could see the sky through the small window, white still heavy with the remnant cloud of the storm, but no longer pressing down with that terrifying intimacy, that sense of the atmosphere itself having become a weapon. The snow outside was 4 feet deep in the open and drifted to 8 and 10 feet against the cliff face in the north wall of the cabin. The world had been rearranged. Every familiar landmark buried, smoothed over, converted into a white landscape that bore no relationship to the one that had existed 4 days ago. Orson Hale stood in the cabin doorway and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he turned back inside and his face held the expression of a man who has survived something he did not expect to survive and is still in the early stages of understanding what that means. Rafe Muldoon was already moving. He had been the first on his feet that morning, had eaten without comment, had checked the condition of his hands and feet with the practiced efficiency of a man who has spent enough time in extreme cold to know exactly which parts of the body lie about how badly they have been damaged. He was functional, he was intact, and he was in the particular way of men who do not have an easy relationship with gratitude, deeply uncomfortable with the fact that he owed his life to someone he had publicly dismissed as a fool. Dorothea Hale sat near the fire with a blanket around her shoulders, both hands wrapped around a cup of broth that Wren had pressed into them at first light. She had said little since the night they arrived, had moved through the days of the storm with a quiet, watchful attention that Wren recognized. It was the same quality of attention she had seen in Dorothea's eyes in the store the day she left Ridgecrest, the gaze of a woman who is measuring something carefully before deciding what to do with her measurement. The three of them prepared to leave that morning with the practical efficiency of frontier people who understood that the window of good weather after a storm was not something to waste on ceremony. Orson paused before stepping out the door. He turned back to Wren, and in the clear, cold morning light that fell through the open doorway, his face looked different than it had in the store 3 months ago. The round spectacles were the same. The careful, measuring eyes behind them were the same. But something in the set of his expression had changed. Some layer of comfortable certainty had been stripped away by 4 days inside a structure he had not believed possible, surviving on resources he had not believed existed, owing his life to a judgment he had dismissed without a second thought. He reached into his coat. He placed a gold coin on the table beside Wren's hand. "This is not charity," he said. His voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. "This is payment for supplies and shelter, a transaction between equals." Wren looked at the coin. Then she looked at him. She picked it up. "That is what it is," she said. Orson nodded once. He put his hat on and walked out into the snow. Dorothea embraced her before she followed a brief, firm embrace, the kind that carries more words than most conversations. She pulled back and looked at Wren's face for a moment with that same measuring gaze. Then she followed her husband out into the white. Rafe Muldoon stood at the door last. He held his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim, the way a man turns a problem he cannot quite solve by any method available to him. He was not a man who owed debts willingly. He was not a man who had a ready vocabulary for the territory he was currently standing in. He looked at Wren. "I owe you," he said. His voice was flat and simple and entirely without performance. "Rafe Muldoon pays what he owes." He put his hat on his head and walked out into the snow without looking back. Wren stood in the doorway and watched 3 dark figures diminish against the white, growing smaller with each step until the landscape absorbed them entirely. She stood there for a long time after they disappeared. The cold air moved against her face. The silence was immense and clean and entirely her own. Then she went inside and began the morning. The fire needed tending, the animals needed water and feed. The garden needed checking. She had been unable to get into the inner cave during the worst of the storm without disturbing her guests, and she was anxious to see what 3 days of slightly lower temperature had done to the lettuces. She moved through the tasks in the order they demanded, which was the only order that mattered, and the familiar rhythm of the work settled over her like something she had not realized she had missed during the compressed strangeness of the storm days. The lettuces were fine, better than fine. The cooler temperature had seemed, if anything, to firm them slightly, to concentrate whatever pale, stubborn life they had been producing in the consistent dark of the cave into something more deliberate. She pinched a leaf and tasted it. Green and clean and faintly bitter, the taste of something growing against every reasonable expectation. She stood in the cave with her lantern and looked at the rows of pale growth in the raised beds of dark soil and felt something she was careful not to call pride because pride felt premature. What she felt was more like the cautious satisfaction of a hypothesis being quietly confirmed. The ewe had more milk than usual. The chickens had been laying through the storm with their customary indifference to external conditions, and there were 6 eggs in the nesting box, 6 small, perfect arguments against the proposition that nothing could survive up here. She collected them and went back into the cabin and made breakfast, and she ate it alone at the table in the morning light. And it tasted like every other meal she had eaten alone at that table, which was to say, it tasted like work and like the particular flavor of a life that was entirely hers. 3 days after the storm, Orson Hale made the climb to Hollow Rock. He arrived breathing hard from the ascent, his spectacles fogged from the transition between the cold outside and the relative warmth of the cabin. He sat at the table and accepted a cup of water from the spring without comment, and he placed a folded document in front of Wren before he said a single word about why he had come. She unfolded it, the letterhead of the Ridgecrest County Land Office. Below it, in the neat hand of someone paid to be precise, a certified statement of the tax assessment on the Hollow Rock claim. $7, not 12. 7. Wren read the number twice. She set the paper down on the table with a steadiness that required more effort than it appeared to require. Orson's face was flushed with a cold, contained anger that sat in his jaw and made his eyes sharp behind the spectacles. He lied to you, he said. Fletcher Grundy told you $12. The actual assessment is 7. He inflated the number by $5. He paused. That $5 was not an accident. He calculated exactly what you could earn between November and March, with no established trade and no credit. He set the number $5 above that ceiling. He meant for you to fail. Wren looked at the certified statement for a moment longer. Then she stood up and went outside. She picked up the axe. She found a round of pine she had been meaning to split since before the storm, and she split it not with her usual measured efficiency, but with a force that was slightly in excess of what the task required, the axe coming down harder than necessary, the wood flying apart in pieces that scattered further than they should have. She split the whole round. Then she found another one. After the second round was split, she set the axe down and stood with her hands on her knees and breathed the cold air until her pulse returned to something she recognized as her own. She went back inside. She sat down at the table. She picked up the certified statement and read the number one more time. $7. She reached for the gold coin Orson had paid her for shelter and supplies. She counted the small additional earnings from the trades she had conducted over the winter, eggs and vegetables exchanged for nails and rope and a tin of coffee and a length of good leather. She laid it all out on the table and added it up. $7.14. She looked at the numbers for a long moment. Then she looked at Orson. She counted out $7 and set it aside. The land is mine, she said. Orson nodded. He was already thinking about the next part. She could see it in his face, the part he had not come here only to deliver a tax document to tell her. There is more, he said. Grundy's lawyers filed a boundary dispute with the county last week. He is claiming that the western edge of the Hollow Rock property overlaps with the land he purchased from your father. He has a surveyor coming from Denver to support the claim. Wren was quiet. If the dispute is accepted, Orson continued, he gains legal access to the interior of the property, which means legal access to the water source. And even if it is not accepted, the legal cost of defending it would take everything you have and more. She already knew this. She had known it was coming in some form since the morning she read the fragments of Agnes's warning in the tin box. Men like Grundy did not make one attempt and accept the result. They were architects. They built structures. When one approach was blocked, they did not abandon the project. They redirected, found the next point of entry, applied the next lever. The boundary dispute was simply the next phase of something that had been in progress for 30 years. Thank you, she said, for coming up here, for checking the records. Orson picked up his hat. He held it for a moment. I should have checked a lot of things a lot sooner, he said. He put the hat on and went to the door. Then he stopped with his hand on the frame. He will come here himself before the end of February, Orson said. Men like Grundy come in person when they believe the matter is close to settled. He will want to watch you hand it over. He paused. I want you to know, when he comes, he will not find the situation he expects. He stepped out into the cold. His footsteps crunched away down the trail. The silence returned. Wren sat at the table with the certified tax statement and $7.14, in the full clear understanding that the next move was not Grundy's. It was hers. She had perhaps 3 weeks. She needed to use them correctly. She wrote a letter that afternoon, careful, precise, stating only what needed to be stated. She addressed it to Constance Pruitt with a request that Orson carry it to town on his next ascent. She had not asked Constance for the deed when they met at the edge of town because that had not been the right moment, and Constance had understood this without being told, had given her only the map and sent her on her way. But now the moment had arrived, and Constance would know it as clearly as Wren did. The reply came 6 days later. Not in the form of a letter, Constance Pruitt came herself. She appeared on the trail below the cabin on a clear morning in the second week of February, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of a woman of 70 who has been walking difficult ground her entire life and intends to keep walking it until the ground itself gives way. Her cane was a length of dark hardwood worn smooth by decades of use. Her back curved slightly at the shoulders, the curve of a life spent leaning into hard work. But her eyes when she arrived at the cabin door were sharp and entirely present. She carried a leather folder under her arm. Wren brought her inside and gave her water and did not rush her. Constance sat at the table and looked around the cabin with the careful, comprehensive attention of someone conducting an inventory. She looked at the walls and the fireplace and the door and the window. She looked through the low opening into the cave beyond where the sounds of the animals and the faint, steady drip of the spring were audible in the cabin's quiet. Something moved through her expression, not surprise, because Wren had the impression that Constance Pruitt did not surprise easily, but something that might have been its quieter, more durable cousin. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition of a shape she had been waiting a long time to see. Agnes would have been glad, Constance said finally. She was quiet for a moment. Then she opened the leather folder. Inside was a document, not a copy. The original, the paper aged to a deep cream, the ink still dark, the official stamp of the Ridgecrest County Land Office still clearly legible in the lower right corner. The deed of purchase for the Hollow Rock claim, dated April 14, 1862, signed by Agnes Calloway. Witnessed by Constance Pruitt, then 30 years younger and newly arrived in Ridgecrest County with her husband. Attached to the deed by a rusted pin was a folded sheet of survey paper, a property map drawn by a county surveyor, every boundary line measured and recorded, every corner marker noted, with its description and distance. Constance spread the survey map on the table. She pointed. This is the eastern boundary of the Calloway farm, she said, and this is the western boundary of the Hollow Rock property. The gap between them is 63 feet of open ridge. She traced the lines with one finger. Grundy purchased your father's property last month. He cannot claim that 63 feet. It has never belonged to anyone but the mountain. Wren studied the map. She studied every line, every measurement, every corner marker. She memorized the numbers. I have carried this document for 27 years, Constance said. Agnes gave it to me the year after she filed it. She told me to keep it somewhere other than the property, somewhere Grundy could not access if he ever decided to move against the claim directly. She was already worried about him then. He had made his first approach to buy the land 2 years after she acquired it, and she had refused, and the refusal had not sat well with a man who was not accustomed to being told no. Wren looked up from the map. What does he know about the water? Constance was quiet for a moment. He knows there is a significant underground source beneath the property. He has known it for years. There was a geological survey of the county in 1871 that noted subsurface hydrology in this area without specifying the exact location. His ranch depends on Copper Creek, and Copper Creek has been dropping every summer for a decade. A man with Grundy's operation, Grundy's ambitions in a county that is getting drier every year, a reliable underground source in this location would not just improve his situation. It would give him control of the water table for the entire valley. Every ranch in 20 miles would be dependent on his goodwill. She folded the map back along its original creases with the care of someone returning something to the condition in which it belongs. Agnes understood this before anyone else did. She continued. That was why she would not sell. Not because the land had sentimental value, though it did, because she understood what handing it to Grundy would mean for everyone else in the county. She was thinking 20 years ahead. She was always thinking 20 years ahead. Constance closed the leather folder and pushed it across the table to Wren. It belongs with you now, she said. Agnes was very clear about that. When the right person came to this land and understood it, it would be time. Wren placed her hand on the folder. She did not speak for a moment. Then she said, I need you to be there when he comes. Constance looked at her. Something in the old woman's face shifted, not reluctance, not hesitation, but the particular expression of someone who has been waiting to be asked exactly this question for a very long time. I will be there, she said. 3 days after Constance's visit, on a morning that came in cold and clear, with the particular diamond quality of February light in high country, Wren heard a knock at the cabin door. She was at the woodpile axe in hand, and she set it down and went to the door and opened it. Cale stood on the step. He was thinner than he had been in September. His cheekbones were sharper. His wrists emerged from the sleeves of his coat, a coat that had been adequate in the fall, and was not adequate now with the narrow, exposed quality of someone who has been short on food through a hard winter. His boots were splitting at the left toe, the leather pulling away from the sole with a gap that let in the cold and the wet. His eyes were red at the edges from wind and from something that was not wind, but they were steady. He had always had steady eyes. He had a small bundle on his back, everything he owned. He said father sold the farm to Grundy, paid off the debt, went to work as a hired hand in a town down the valley. He told me to come with him. He paused. The wind moved his hair across his forehead. I came here instead. Wren looked at her brother for a moment, at the cold, reddened face and the splitting boots, and the bundle that contained the whole of his 13-year-old life. Then she stepped back from the doorway, and he came inside. She wrapped her arms around him. His arms came around her waist and held on with the strength of someone who has traveled a long distance alone and is only now allowing their body to acknowledge how frightened it has been. She held him until the rigidity in his shoulders began to let go, until she felt him breathe, really breathe, not the shallow, careful breathing of cold and effort, but the deeper, slower breath of someone who has arrived somewhere they intended to be. When they sat down and she had fed him, and he had met the sheep and the chickens with the slightly dazed wonder of someone encountering life in a place they had been told contained none, he told her the rest. He had overheard it, he said. The night before the farm papers were signed, his father and Grundy, at the kitchen table, the same lamp. The same scene that had played out in September, but different now. The debt resolved, the transaction almost complete, the two men in the final stage of an arrangement that had been inevitable since the first loan. Except that Emmett Calloway had not signed the papers and gone quietly. He had looked across the table at Silas Grundy, and he had said in a voice that Cale described as shaking, not with fear, Cale was careful to specify, but with something else, something that had been compressed down for too long, and was finally in this last moment being allowed its full pressure. He had said, I am selling you this farm. That is done. We both understand that I have no choice, and you made certain I would have no choice. But Hollow Rock is not part of this transaction. It is not part of this farm. It has never been and part of this farm. It is my mother's land left to my daughter by deed, and you have no claim to it. Not 1 inch of it, not a single foot. And Grundy had leaned back in his chair and smiled the smile of a man who knows he is going to win and is already tasting the winning. He had said, you don't have the money to prove that in a courtroom, Emmett, and neither does she. And Emmett Calloway had stood up from the table. He had picked up his hat. He had walked to the door of the house that was no longer his. And before he went through it, he had turned back and looked at Grundy one final time, and he had said nothing else because there was nothing else to say, because Grundy was right about the courtroom, and they both knew it. But he had said what he had said. Wren sat at the table and listened to her brother tell this story and felt something move inside her chest, not a large movement, not the dramatic unlocking of something long sealed. A smaller thing, a slight loosening, the way a knot does not untie itself all at once, but begins with one strand shifting a fraction of an inch, just enough to change the tension in the whole. She thought about the hand that had trembled holding the money pouch. She thought about the eyes that would not meet hers. She thought about her father's last whispered words at the door. Don't sell that land, spoken by a man who knew the full shape of what Grundy wanted and understood he was powerless to fight it, but could not let her go without that single piece of armor. She understood it now. Her father had not been a man who chose to discard her. He had been a man being crushed by a mechanism he had not built and could not stop, and in the last moment available to him, with the only means available to him, he had stood up and said the true thing out loud, knowing full well it would change nothing, knowing Grundy would smile, knowing the courtroom remark was accurate. He had said it anyway. That was not the same as not caring. It was the specific grief of a man who cared enormously and was entirely powerless, which was its own kind of unbearable. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she looked at Cale. "He is going to come here," she said. "Grundy, before the end of the month." Cale nodded. He had been expecting her to say this. "Then we need to be ready," he said. He said it with the simple confidence of someone for whom the question of whether to stand and face the thing was not actually a question. Wren looked at her brother, at the steady eyes and the splitting boot, and the bone-deep loyalty that had made him walk alone through a February mountain pass rather than follow their father down into the valley. "Yes," she said, "we do." In the days that followed, she moved with the focused intensity of someone who has identified what needs doing and is working through the list without sentiment. She sent word to Orson through a passing teamster. She confirmed with Constance that she was needed. She found Rafe Muldoon's camp in the lower ravine where he had returned to his trapping routes after the storm, and she told him what was coming. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at her for a moment with the eyes that had spent 20 years reading the wilderness. "I will be on the ridge," he said. That was all. She paid the $7 to the county tax office, through Orson's hand received the receipt, and placed it in the leather folder alongside Agnes's deed and the survey map. She checked the cabin, every wall, every hinge, every chink of dried mud between the logs. She checked the fireplace and the chimney. She checked the animal pens in the cave and the garden beds and the flow of the spring in the inner chamber. She checked every element of the system she had built through the fall and winter, the interconnected whole that had kept 4 people alive through the worst storm in a decade, and she found it sound. She was ready. Silas Grundy came on the last day of February. He came the way powerful men come when they want to make a point about their power. Not alone, not quietly, but in a column. He rode at the head of it on a gray horse, his leather coat dark against the snow, his bearing the bearing of a man who has arrived to conclude a matter that was never seriously in doubt. Fletcher rode beside him, younger and less patient, with the restless energy of someone who has been told the outcome in advance and is simply waiting for the formality of it to be completed. 3 hired men rode behind them, hard-faced, cold-eyed, the specific type of men that a man like Grundy employed for the specific purpose of making the arithmetic of a confrontation obvious before a word was spoken. 5 men on horseback coming up the trail in the clear, cold morning. They dismounted at the base of the final approach and climbed the last quarter mile on foot, their boots breaking through the crust of old snow, their breath rising and dissolving in the still air. Grundy moved well for a man of his age and size. He was not a man who had lost the capability for real effort. He had simply arranged his life so that he rarely needed to exert it. He stopped 10 paces from the cabin door. Wren stood in the doorway. Cale was behind her, slightly to her left, his hand resting on the doorframe with a casualness that was not entirely casual. Grundy's expression was pleasant, practiced, the expression of a man who has walked into a great many difficult conversations and emerged from all of them with what he came for. "Miss Calloway," he said, "I have come to make you a reasonable offer." His voice carried easily in the cold air that low, unhurried rumble that filled whatever space it occupied. "My attorneys have reviewed the boundary situation. There is a legitimate question about the western edge of your property that a court would need to resolve. That process takes time. It takes money. I have considerable experience of how these things go, and I can tell you that neither the time nor the money is pleasant." He paused. He let the silence do its work. "I am prepared to offer you $25 for the Hollow Rock claim." He allowed that to register. "That is 3 times the county's assessed value. It is more than fair, Miss Calloway. You and the boy could go somewhere more suitable. Start fresh." He said the word neighbors as though it were a gift he was offering her, as though the 2 of them in some other version of events might have been allies rather than what they were. Wren looked at him. She looked at Fletcher beside him with his expression of impatient ownership. She looked at the three men behind them, who were there to make a point that had not yet needed to be made explicitly. She was about to answer when she heard it. The sound she had been waiting for, had been listening for beneath the surface of Grundy's words since the moment he arrived. Hoofbeats, and beneath them the slower, heavier sound of a wagon, coming up the trail from the direction of Ridgecrest. Grundy heard it too. Something shifted in his expression, not alarm, not yet, but the first movement of a man recalculating. Orson Hale's wagon came around the lower bend in the trail, first moving as fast as the snow-covered track allowed Orson handling the reins with the focused attention of someone driving towards something rather than away from it. Dorothea sat beside him on the bench, a shawl around her shoulders, her hands folded in her lap, her face carrying its familiar quality of watchful stillness. Behind the wagon, the blacksmith on his mule, a man of few words and considerable physical presence, who had ridden up this trail once before with a set of iron hinges as a gift and was riding it now for a different reason. Two farming families behind him, the men on foot, the women beside them, all of them moving with the purposeful gait of people who have decided something and are acting on the decision before the deciding can be reconsidered. The minister, a thin man in a black coat who came out of the church on Sundays and rarely appeared elsewhere, was making his way up the trail on a borrowed horse with the uncertain seat of a man more comfortable with theology than equestrian activity. He was here nonetheless. And behind all of them, moving at her own pace, which was the pace she had always moved at and had never once apologized for Constance Pruitt, her cane in her right hand, the leather folder under her left arm, climbing the trail with the slow, absolute determination of a woman who has been waiting 27 years for this particular morning and intends to arrive at it without hurrying and without stopping. They assembled in the area below the cabin, spreading out naturally into a semicircle behind and around Grundy's men, not surrounding them in any aggressive sense, but simply occupying the space, changing its character, transforming what had been a private conversation between a powerful man and a girl with nothing into something else entirely. Something witnessed, something public, something that would be remembered and repeated in the county for a long time after today. Grundy looked at them. He took a full count. His expression remained pleasant, but it had become a more deliberate pleasantness, the kind that requires effort to maintain. Well, he said, this is quite a gathering, but the matter at hand is a legal question, and I don't see how an audience changes the law. Orson stepped down from the wagon. He moved to the front of the group with the steady, deliberate manner of a man who has had several weeks to decide what he wants to say and has reduced it to its essential elements. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He simply spoke clearly in the cold air in front of everyone present. Silas, he said, before these witnesses, the tax assessment on the Hollow Rock claim is $7, not $12. I have the certified statement from the county land office. Your son told Miss Calloway the amount was $12. That difference of $5 was calculated with the specific intent of placing the payment beyond her reach before the deadline. He paused. I want that said out loud in front of these people so that it is said. Grundy's eyes moved to Fletcher, a brief controlled movement. Fletcher's jaw tightened. Constance Pruitt had reached the front of the group. She moved past Orson without ceremony and stopped 6 feet from Grundy. She set the tip of her cane in the snow and opened the leather folder under her arm. She removed the deed first. She held it up not dramatically, not for effect, but simply so that it was visible. The aged paper, the clear dark signature, the official stamp. This is the original deed of purchase for the Hollow Rock claim, she said, dated April 14th, 1862, signed by Agnes Calloway, witnessed by myself, recorded at the Ridgecrest County Land Office. She spoke each fact with the precision of someone reading from a legal instrument, which was in fact what she was doing. She removed the survey map. She held that up as well. This is the property survey conducted at the time of purchase and attached to the deed of record. The western boundary of the Hollow Rock property and the eastern boundary of the Calloway farm are separated by 63 feet of open ridge that has never belonged to any private party. There is no overlap. There has never been an overlap. Any boundary dispute claiming otherwise will not survive the first hour of examination by a competent surveyor. She returned the documents to the folder. She closed it. She looked at Grundy with eyes that had been looking at men like him for 7 decades and had lost neither their clarity nor their patience. The mountain was very quiet. The wind had died to almost nothing. The late February sun lay low and flat across the snow, painting everything in the particular gold of a season almost finished, almost ready to turn. Grundy stood in the center of it, surrounded by the people he had managed and maneuvered and used for years, the storekeeper whose practical advice had almost sent Wren east on a stage, the trapper who had echoed that advice with cheerful certainty, the farming families who had watched the Callaway situation from a careful distance and said nothing. They were all here now. They were all looking at him. And they were all seeing clearly, and at the same time the same thing, the architecture of what he had done laid out in the open air of a February morning for anyone with eyes to read. Grundy looked at Wren. It was not the look he had arrived with, the measuring, dismissive appraisal of a man confirming that the obstacle in front of him is the size he estimated. This was something different. This was the look of a man reassessing a situation that has not developed as his models predicted, identifying what he missed, cataloging where the errors of assumption occurred. What he saw was a girl of 18 in a coat that had been secondhand when she got it, standing in the doorway of a cabin she had built herself on land her grandmother had protected for 30 years, holding the accumulated weight of every day she had spent here. Every log she had cut, every stone she had placed, every morning. She had risen before light to tend the fire and the animals and the impossible garden growing in the dark behind her. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his horse. He said nothing. He simply turned and began to ride back down the trail, and the silence of his departure was more complete and more eloquent than anything his practiced voice could have produced. Fletcher looked at his father, then at the assembled people that followed. The hired men followed Fletcher. Their horses moved down the trail and around the lower bend and were gone, absorbed back into the landscape as though the morning had never contained them. The people who remained stood for a moment in the quiet that followed. Then one by one and two by two they came forward. The blacksmith pressed her hand without words, which was how he communicated everything that mattered. One of the farming wives brought forward a cloth-wrapped parcel salt pork and a jar of last summer's preserves pressed into Wren's hands with a directness that made the gesture feel like a statement rather than an offering. The minister said something brief and genuine that was neither a sermon nor a platitude. Orson clasped her hand with both of his. Dorothea held her gaze for a moment with the same expression she had worn in the store the day she pressed the seeds into Wren's palm, that complicated, recognizing look, now resolved into something simpler and more settled. Constance Pruitt was the last. She looked at Wren for a long moment without speaking. Then she nodded once, a slow, deliberate nod, the kind that travels across decades, the kind that carries the weight of a promise made to someone who is no longer here to receive its fulfillment. Agnes was right about you, she said quietly. Then she turned and began her slow, cane-tapping descent. Rafe Muldoon did not come down from the ridge. He had been up there through the whole of it. Wren had caught the distant shape of him against the skyline. At one point, the long rifle across his knees, the hat pulled low. When the Grundy party descended and the townspeople began their own departures, she looked up at the ridge again, and the shape was gone. He had simply stood up and walked back into the tree line. He had been there when it mattered. Sometimes that is everything. And then Emmett Callaway appeared at the bottom of the trail. He came alone, on foot, moving slowly, placing each step with care on the ice surface of the path, his hat held in his hands, rather than on his head, his breath coming in short white clouds from the effort of the climb. He had not ridden because there was no horse to ride. He had given up the horse, with the farm had given up most things with the farm, and what remained was a man in a coat that was too thin for the altitude climbing a trail. He had no right to expect a welcome at the top of. His hair had gone gray at the temples since September. Not the gray of age, but the gray of a man who has lain awake too many nights doing an accounting he cannot balance, and he moved like someone carrying a weight his body was never designed to hold. He had heard it from a man at the mill in the valley below that Grundy intended to ride up to Hollow Rock on the last day of February. He had not been invited. He had come anyway. He did not look up as he climbed. He watched his own feet. He arrived at the edge of the cleared area below the cabin and stopped. The departing townspeople moved around him the way water moves around a fixed object, nodding to him, giving him space, sensing, without being told, that whatever was about to happen in this clearing was not for an audience. Cale was in the doorway. He looked at his father. The expression on his face was the specific expression of a boy who has chosen between two people he loves and lives with, that choice daily. Not regretting it, not capable of regretting it, but fully aware of its cost. Emmett looked at the cabin. He looked at it the way you look at evidence. He looked at the walls and the stone chimney and the packed earth of the cleared area around the door. He looked at the woodpile stacked precisely against the cliff face with the careful geometry of someone who understands that disorder in the physical world costs you in ways you cannot always anticipate. He looked at the garden plot beside the south wall, still under snow, but with the dark lines of prepared earth visible beneath it, the evidence of planning and labor, and an understanding of seasons that a girl of 18 should not yet possess but did. He looked at all of it for a long time, and then he looked at Wren. She looked back at him. She thought about the $17 in the deed and the trembling hand and the flat voice and the eyes that would not meet hers on a September morning that felt like it belonged to a different life. She thought about the tin box in the cave with Agnes's ring and Agnes's warning and the name Grundy written in her grandmother's shaking hand. She thought about 3 minutes in the dark with her face pressed against her arm and a decision to keep moving when moving was the only thing that was not giving up. She thought about what Cale had told her, the kitchen table, the lamp, the shaking voice shaking not from fear, but from the compressed fury of a man spending his last resource and the true words spoken into the face of a man who held all the cards. Not weakness, not cowardice. The specific, costly courage of a man who is going to lose and knows it and says the true thing anyway. She thought about the whispered words at the door. Don't sell that land, the first piece of armor he had been able to give her, the only one he had. She understood it now. She had understood it since Cale told her, but understanding something and being ready to act on the understanding were different distances, and she had needed the days between then and now to travel the second one. She did not run to him. She did not say the words that forgiveness requires because forgiveness of this size does not arrive fully formed in a single moment. It arrives in stages over time with the patience of water working on stone, slowly, steadily, without announcement. But she stepped back from the doorway. She moved to one side, clearing the path between where her father stood and the interior of the cabin, the fire, the table, the warmth, the bowl of stew that was always simmering, that had fed 4 strangers through a blizzard and would feed her family now. She nodded once. It was not absolution. It was not an embrace. It was an open door, which is the most powerful and most costly thing one person can offer another. And it cost her exactly what it cost, the acknowledgement that the full weight of what had happened was real, and that she was choosing to let him in anyway, and that these two things could coexist. Emmett looked at the open doorway. Then he crossed the 20 feet of snow between them, slowly, one step at a time, the longest short distance either of them had ever walked. He stopped at the threshold. He looked at his daughter. His eyes in the February light were the eyes of a man at the far end of something that had consumed months and taken everything it could take and left him standing here with nothing except the one thing that could not be confiscated or foreclosed upon. The capacity to say what was true. I was wrong, he said. 3 words from Emmett Calloway, who had always rationed language the way a careful man rations water in a dry country. 3 words that weighed what they weighed. Wren held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned to the fire. She ladled stew from the pot that had been simmering since morning, thick with beans and salt, and the pale winter vegetables from the cave garden, the flavor of everything she had built concentrated in a bowl. She set it on the table. She set a second bowl for Cale. She sat down. There were 3 people at the table. There were 3 bowls of stew. The fire crackled with its steady, patient certainty. In the cave behind the wall, the spring ran its continuous quiet note. Into the stone basin, the sound of water that would not run dry, the sound Agnes had known and protected and passed forward through 40 years. In a tin box, in a piece of paper, in a deed to a piece of ground that everyone but Agnes had called worthless. Cale ate 2 full bowls and did not cough once. Spring came to Hollow Rock the way spring comes to the high country, not in a single arrival, but in a slow accumulation of evidence. First, the sound of meltwater finding its way downhill through channels that had been silent since November. Then the dark patches of earth appearing through the snow like words emerging from a page. Then the smell, the deep, complicated perfume of soil waking from months of cold, a smell that contained within it the specific promise of everything that soil will produce when given water and time. Then the birds. Coming back one by one from wherever they had spent the winter, filling the morning air with sounds so unexpected after the long silence that Wren stopped in the middle of her work the first time she heard them and stood perfectly still and listened with the full grateful attention of someone receiving something they did not fully believe they had earned. The letter from the Denver Geological Survey Company arrived on a Thursday in early March, carried up from Ridgecrest by Orson Hale, who had taken over the role of mountain courier with the cheerful willingness of a man performing a penance he has chosen for himself. The letter's letterhead was formal, and its language was precise, and its central proposition was straightforward. The company had learned through the county records Orson had accessed of the underground hydrology associated with the Hollow Rock property. They were conducting a comprehensive survey of subsurface water sources in western Colorado. They wished to include the Hollow Rock site. They were prepared to offer an annual lease fee for survey access, the amount modest but meaningful, recurring, and entirely separate from any question of ownership, which would remain entirely with Wren. She read the letter sitting on the step of the cabin in the March sun, Cale beside her, the lamb born in the last week of a long winter, sturdy and indignant about most things, pressing its head against Cale's knee with the cheerful insistence of the very young. Chickens moved around their feet. The smell of new earth was in the air. She read it twice. She set it down on her knee and looked out at the country below her, the ridges and ravines, and the distant suggestion of the valley floor where Ridgecrest sat in its single street between church and saloon, and where things were already different than they had been. Grundy was not gone. She understood this clearly and did not allow herself the comfortable mistake of believing otherwise. He was patient. He had been patient for 30 years. He would find another angle, another instrument, another lever. Men of his kind did not stop because one approach had been closed. They recalculated. They waited. They were architecture, not weather. But she was also architecture. She was the cabin and the cave and the garden and the spring. She was the walls she had built and the fire she had kept burning and the system she had built from nothing, with 2 hands and a grandmother's stubbornness in her blood. She was the document in the leather folder and the $7 paid and the survey lines that Constance Pruitt had carried for 27 years waiting for the right morning. She was patient too, and she had the mountain. The annual fee from the survey company would pay the taxes with enough remaining to fund the cold smoker she had been planning since January, a structure built into the natural fissure in the cliff face using the mountain's own geometries to cure meat through the winter months. It would fund a deeper root cellar excavated further into the cool earth beneath the cave floor. It would fund the small greenhouse she had sketched out on a piece of brown paper. On a February night, its back wall, the heat-absorbing granite of the cliff itself, extending the growing season by the precious weeks on either end that made the difference between subsistence and abundance. There was the question of Cale's schooling. The minister had made an approach tentative, genuine about the possibility of lessons in exchange for eggs and winter vegetables. It was worth pursuing. Cale's mind was the best tool on the property, better than the axe, better than the saw, and it needed what good tools always need: sharpening use in the respect of being given work worthy of its capacity. Her father came on Sundays, sometimes on Saturdays too, making the climb on foot when no horse was available, arriving with his shirt damp from the effort and his breathing heavy from the altitude, carrying something each time: a coil of rope, a bag of nails, a set of iron brackets for the door frame. He found things to fix, and he fixed them with the quiet competence of a man whose hands remembered how to do good work, even when the rest of him was still finding its footing. He did not ask for more than was offered. He did not explain himself beyond what the work explained. He simply came and he worked and he stayed through the afternoon meal, and then he went back down the mountain. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The fuller accounting would come in time, in the accumulated weeks and months of ordinary proximity, in the 100 small daily moments that constitute the actual texture of a relationship rather than its dramatic points. That was how it worked. Not in declarations, but in presence. Not in a single gesture, but in the patient, repeated act of showing up. Wren stood in front of the cliff face on an evening in early April in the amber light of a sun going down behind the western peaks and looked at the granite. It glowed as though lit from within the same stone her grandmother had loved for 40 years, the same stone that had sheltered her through the worst winter of her life, the same stone that held in its deep interior the water that Silas Grundy wanted and could not have. Behind her, Cale was reading aloud from Agnes's book, his voice clear and confident and entirely free of the tightness that had lived in his chest through every previous winter of his life. The dry, steady air of the cave had done what the valley air had never managed, had given his lungs the stillness they needed to find their own rhythm. He read to the lamb at his feet and to the evening sky and to whoever might be listening, and the words of the book moved out into the air and were carried away by the light wind. Emmett was inside. She could hear the sound of his hammer, steady and measured, working on the door frame. He had decided needed reinforcing a judgment that was technically correct and also not entirely about the door frame. The rhythm of it was a familiar sound. It had been the soundtrack of her childhood, that particular cadence of her father's work, and hearing it now in the cabin she had built was something she had no name for yet. She would find the name in time. There was time. The spring in the inner chamber ran its continuous note. The chickens had gone to roost. The ewe stood in the entrance to the cave pen, watching the evening with the tolerant patience of animals who have come through a hard winter and arrived on the other side of it intact. She had plans: the cold smoker, the root cellar, the greenhouse, Cale's education, the letter to the survey company that needed a careful reply stating the terms she was willing to accept and the terms she was not, the list of improvements to the cabin that her father's eye had identified and that her hands would eventually address one by one in the order that mattered. She had work. She would always have work. That was not a burden. That had always been the point. The daily act of building and tending and protecting and growing, this was not the price of survival. This was survival itself and more than survival. This was meaning made concrete, made physical, made real in the form of walls that held, and fire that burned, and water that ran, and green things growing in the dark where no one had thought to look. She turned back toward the cabin. The door stood open behind her, the door she had built with her own hands from planks she had split, and hinges the blacksmith had forged, in a frame her father had squared on a Sunday afternoon with the careful attention of a man trying to give something back in the only language available to him. She had built this door. She had hung it and fitted it and learned its particular weight and the exact angle at which it swung freely. She knew the sound it made when the wind caught it. She knew how it sat in its frame in the deep cold when the wood contracted and the fit became tight, and how it loosened again in the warmth of midday. She knew this door the way you know the things you have made yourself completely, specifically in all its details and all its imperfections. And she left it open, not because she had forgotten to close it, not from carelessness, but because a door you build yourself is a door that you control, and a door that you control can be opened as easily as it can be closed. And sometimes after a long winter and a hard fight in a journey that began with nothing and arrived at something that mattered, the most powerful act available to you is to leave it open, to let the evening light come in, to let the warmth from the fire move out, to stand on the boundary between the inside and the outside of the life you have built and choose deliberately and fully to face the country on the other side of it. The country was vast and cold and beautiful and entirely indifferent to whether she survived or did not. It had been here before her and would be here after her and did not require her to be remarkable or courageous or anything other than what she was, a girl of 18 with calloused hands and her grandmother's eyes, standing on a mountainside in the last light of an April evening, listening to her brother read and her father work and the water run in the dark behind her. She was alive. She had built something that mattered. She had held the door against everything that tried to push it closed, and she had won that particular argument. And the argument was not finished. It would never be finished, which was not a defeat but a fact, the defining fact of a life on this kind of land. But she had won today, and today was what she had. Tomorrow the cold smoker. Next week the survey company's reply. Next month the planting, the real planting, the first true spring planting on this land in 40 years, with seeds enough for a proper garden and soil she had spent a winter enriching and water that would not run dry. The light was going. The first stars appeared above the eastern ridge, faint and fixed and patient. The same stars her grandmother had watched from this same ground, the same stars that would be here when Wren was gone and someone else stood where she stood and looked up at the permanent things. She breathed the evening air, cold, still, always cold, at this elevation even in spring, and she felt the solid, unremarkable, entirely sufficient fact of being here. She went inside. The fire needed a log before dark. Cale was still reading, his voice carrying the steady cadence of someone who has found a rhythm and intends to keep it. Her father's hammer had gone quiet, which meant the work was finished, or he had found something more interesting to inspect. Either way, there would be a question at the dinner table, and she would have an answer, and that was a kind of ordinary miracle she was not yet accustomed to and did not intend to take for granted. The door stood open behind her just for a moment longer while the last of the April light came in and mixed with the firelight, and the sound of the spring moved through the wall from the cave beyond, and the evening settled over Hollow Rock with the patient certainty of something that has been doing this for a very long time and intends to keep doing it. Then the wind shifted, and she reached back and pulled the door nearly closed, not shut, just nearly leaving the thin line of evening air and light at its edge, enough to let the night know it was not forgotten, enough to remind herself that the boundary between inside and outside was one she had built and one she chose. The heartbeat of the mountain continued faithful as it had always been, as it would always be, counting out the time and drops of water falling into stone.